It was already late, the kind of late where even the television hum feels too loud. I had just poured myself a second cup of chamomile tea, hoping to wind down from a day that felt heavier than most. The house was quiet, still holding the echo of loneliness that had become almost comfortable. My robe hung loose on my shoulders, the fabric soft from years of use, and the lamp cast a dim, warm light across the living room. I was settled, prepared to do nothing but sit in silence, maybe drift off to sleep in the chair. And then the phone rang. Her name lit up on the screen, unexpected, unfamiliar in this hour. We had exchanged numbers out of politeness at the end of a support group meeting weeks ago, but we never used them. She was the kind of woman who always sat 2 chairs away, arms folded across her chest like armor. We had nodded at each other in recognition, nothing more. I stared at the screen, my thumb hesitating above the answer button, heart thudding in a way that felt irrational. I didn't owe her anything, and yet I answered. Her voice didn't match the strength she carried in the group. It was small, cracked, nearly unrecognizable. She didn't ask how I was or if she was disturbing me. She simply said she couldn't stay in her apartment another second, that the walls were pressing in, that the silence had become unbearable. I heard something in her voice that I knew too well. Panic. Not loud or chaotic, but thick and paralyzing. It wrapped around each word like fog. I told her to come over. The words came out before I had time to think. I cleaned nothing. I lit no candles. I didn't brush my hair or put on proper clothes. I sat on the couch, holding the mug like an anchor, and waited. Every second stretched long and uncertain. I stared at the door, the stillness in the room tightening with anticipation. I wondered what I had invited in. I didn't know her, not really. I only knew the shape of her grief, how it lived in the corner of her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. But in that moment, it felt like enough. She arrived with no coat, no bag, only a hoodie zipped up to her chin and her arms wrapped around herself like a child. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, her lips pressed together as if holding back something volatile. I stepped aside, letting her in, unsure whether I should touch her or not. She walked in slowly, like each step cost her something, and sat down without asking where. Her body curled into itself on the far end of the couch, legs tucked up, head lowered. I didn't speak. I didn't have words that would make sense. The space between us was filled with silence, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, almost sacred, like a hush in a church after the final note of a hymn. I reached for the blanket folded over the armrest and gently placed it on her lap. She didn't look up. I returned to my seat, unsure what to do with my hands, my eyes, my breath. She began to tremble, not violently, but with a slow, rhythmic shudder, as though her bones had been holding something in for too long and had finally given up the effort. We didn't speak for hours. The night slipped past us unnoticed, marked only by the shift in shadows and the occasional creak of the house settling. I sat upright most of the time, half asleep but alert, the kind of stillness that feels like waiting. At some point, she laid her head down on the pillow and pulled the blanket up to her chin. I watched the rise and fall of her breathing and thought about how strange it was, letting someone collapse inside your space without warning or explanation. But nothing about it felt wrong. I realized I hadn't asked her why she chose to call me. There were others in the group, women more talkative, more open, more obviously kind. I wasn't warm. I wasn't nurturing. I was the one who stayed quiet, who stared at the floor when it was my turn to speak. But maybe she saw something in that silence, something familiar, something safe. Maybe she needed someone who wouldn't ask questions. The air in the room changed gradually, softening as the hours passed. She began to breathe more evenly. The tension in her shoulders eased. I stayed awake, not out of duty, but because I felt compelled. There was a kind of fragile reverence to her presence, the way one might feel standing too close to a sleeping animal, honored, careful, aware of the delicate line between comfort and fear. I didn't want to disturb it. By the time the sky began to lighten outside, a faint blue washing over the tops of the trees, I had moved slightly closer, not touching, not crowding, just close enough that if she reached out in her sleep, she wouldn't have to reach far. My legs were stiff, my back sore, but I didn't care. I had learned something about stillness in the last few years, about what it means to hold space for another human being. It wasn't about fixing, it was about staying. She stirred just after dawn, blinking slowly like she wasn't sure where she was. Our eyes met and she held my gaze longer than I expected. There was nothing theatrical in the moment, no outpouring or apology, just a quiet recognition, a mutual understanding that what had passed between us wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. She didn't thank me. I didn't need her to. That morning, I made 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with sugar. I placed hers on the table next to where she sat, still wrapped in the blanket, knees drawn to her chest. She took it without speaking, without looking at me, but her fingers brushed mine when she reached, and the touch, though small, held weight. I turned away before she could see the heat rising in my cheeks. Something had shifted, neither of us knew what, but it was real, and it was quietly alive between us. She didn't leave the next day, or the day after that. At first, I thought she just needed a few nights to recover, to steady herself before returning to the silence she couldn't bear. But her things started appearing in small ways. Her toothbrush beside mine, a pair of socks draped over the arm of the couch, a bottle of conditioner in the shower that didn't belong to me. None of it was intentional, at least not in the way people usually move in. It was more like she was melting into the space, becoming part of the air, part of the rhythm. We didn't talk about it. She kept sleeping on the couch, curled under the same blanket I had given her the first night, and I let her. Every morning I made 2 cups of coffee. Every night I left the hallway light on just a little longer than usual, in case she needed to find her way. Our routines began to mirror each other, waking up within minutes of one another, brushing our teeth in a quiet dance of avoidance, passing each other in the kitchen like shadows. We weren't close in the way people expect when they live together, but we weren't apart either. At night, I would hear her breathing through the thin walls, slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that only comes after hours of tension. Sometimes she would shift on the couch, the springs creaking faintly in the dark, and I would find myself holding my breath, waiting for silence to return. I began to sleep differently, lighter, more alert. It wasn't worry exactly. It was a strange kind of attentiveness, like my body had tuned itself to her presence and refused to let go of the frequency. There were moments when we shared space more directly. She would sit at the kitchen table while I cooked, peeling the labels off water bottles, her hands moving in endless repetition. I wouldn't ask questions. She wouldn't offer answers. But her presence grounded me in a way I didn't expect. It made the silence feel less like a void and more like a bond. We were 2 people carrying weight, and though we weren't carrying it together, we were walking in step. One afternoon, I found her laundry folded neatly on my bed. I hadn't asked her to do it. I hadn't even realized she'd used the washer. There was something so intimate about the way her clothes rested beside mine, worn cotton, soft flannel, the scent of unfamiliar detergent mingling with my own. I touched the fabric with a hesitant hand, not knowing what to do with the feeling that rose up inside me. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something more primitive, recognition maybe, or belonging. We had started brushing past each other more often, our movements syncing unintentionally, a hand on the refrigerator door just as the other reached for the handle, a shoulder grazed while rounding the same corner. I would flinch, not from discomfort, but from the intensity of what such brief contact ignited. Her skin was warm, alive, humming with something I couldn't name. I wondered if she noticed it too, if she felt the current that sparked when our bodies aligned for even a second. The couch remained her bed, but sometimes she would stay up with me, watching old movies we never finished. She'd sit on the floor, her back against the front of the couch, and I would sit above her, cross-legged, knees pulled to my chest. We weren't facing each other, but we were back to back. I could feel the heat of her spine through the cushion, the subtle shifts in her posture as she relaxed. It felt safer that way, not having to meet each other's eyes, not having to ask or answer anything. Our connection was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there. I began to measure my day by her silences. The quiet humming she did when she made tea, the way she exhaled before climbing into the blanket, the stillness she wore like a second skin when she thought I wasn't looking. I watched her when I could, subtly, carefully, always aware of the boundary I wasn't sure I had permission to cross. But I couldn't deny the pull. She was no longer just the woman from group. She was something else now, something present, lingering, necessary. Once, I reached for her empty cup and our fingers touched. It was nothing, a moment, a second, but the contact sent a shock through me that I felt all the way down to my toes. I looked up instinctively, and she looked back, but neither of us said a word. Her eyes held something unspoken, a weight I didn't yet understand. I turned away, flushing, and pretended to focus on rinsing the cup. But my hands shook, and the silence between us grew heavier with meaning. I started sleeping with my door open, not wide, just enough to hear her, just enough to feel like we weren't so divided by rooms. I told myself it was for safety, for convenience, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to feel the wall between us anymore. I wanted her presence near. I wanted to be tethered to something that felt real. And she was the realest thing I had touched in a long time. She never asked why I let her stay. I never asked why she hadn't left. We existed in parallel, close enough to feel each other's gravity, far enough to avoid collision. But the space between us was shrinking, little by little, day by day. Every time she left a cup in the sink, every time I found her shoes by the door, every time we passed each other in the narrow hallway and hesitated for half a heartbeat too long, the lines blurred a little more. We were back to back, not touching, not confessing, but holding each other up in the only way we knew how. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know what we were. But I knew that my home no longer felt like just mine. It had started to hum with her presence, and I was beginning to crave the sound. It didn't happen at night the way I would have expected. There was no candlelight or thunderstorm or whispered excuse to close the distance. It happened in the middle of the day, with the sunlight pressing in through the windows and the quiet hum of the fridge filling the silence between us. She was standing near the window, wearing a faded tank top and a pair of loose pants that clung to her hips like second skin. Her hair was pulled up, messy, and her shoulders carried the slow curve of someone who had stopped trying to hold herself together. I was walking by with a laundry basket when I stopped, for no reason I could explain. My feet planted themselves. My body decided before I could think. She didn't turn around, but she didn't have to. I knew she felt it, the weight of my presence, the hesitation in my breath. The moment cracked open like a fruit, tender and inevitable. I stepped closer, slowly, like approaching a wild animal, afraid to startle her, afraid not to. The light caught her skin in a way that made it hard to breathe. I reached out, not to touch, but to anchor myself in the moment. My fingers hovered near the curve of her arm, and when I finally made contact, it was feather-light, almost accidental. But she leaned back into it. That was enough. The first kiss wasn't deliberate. It was born of proximity and stillness and something unspoken swelling too large to contain. My lips brushed the back of her shoulder, soft and unsure, tasting skin that trembled under the contact. She exhaled, long and shaky, her spine stiffening for a second before settling. I waited for her to move away. She didn't. My mouth followed the line of her shoulder, slow and reverent. She turned around only when I paused, and I saw in her eyes the same confusion and longing that had been haunting me for weeks. We didn't speak. We moved. She stepped forward, and I met her halfway. Our mouths found each other as if they had done it 100 times in dreams neither of us would ever admit to. Her lips were dry at first, then warm, pliable, tasting like fear and need and too many nights of silence. I touched her face, her neck, the soft skin just below her jaw. She held my wrists with trembling hands, not to stop me, but to hold on. We kissed like it meant something we didn't yet understand, like the world outside the window had disappeared, and all that remained was this: heat, breath, contact. Clothing became unnecessary, not in the frantic, rushed way I remembered from old lovers, but in a slow, aching unraveling. She undressed me carefully, as if each layer carried a memory that needed to be acknowledged before being removed. My shirt dropped to the floor first, followed by the soft fabric of my lounge pants. She stepped back briefly, eyes sweeping over me, not in hunger, but in awe. When she reached out again, her fingers spread across my ribs, warm and steady, and I felt the press of her palm like a question I didn't know how to answer. We made our way to the couch, the same couch she'd been sleeping on for weeks. It felt transformed now, repurposed. She laid me down with quiet hands, lips returning to mine, knees between my thighs, her body hovering just enough to let me feel the anticipation. Her kisses deepened, tracing the line of my collarbone, dipping between my breasts, slow and careful, like she was memorizing me by touch alone. I arched into her without thinking, breath catching with each new place her mouth explored. She didn't rush. She moved like someone building something permanent. Her hands mapped me. Her mouth worshipped me. She found the places that made my breath hitch and stayed there, patiently learning the rhythm of my need. I clutched at her shoulders, her hips, the curls at the nape of her neck. My legs wrapped around her instinctively, drawing her closer, until our bodies were pressed so tightly I couldn't tell where she ended and I began. When her fingers finally slid between my thighs, I gasped, the sound raw and startled, and she stilled, just for a moment, watching my face. I nodded, barely, and she continued. Her touch was soft, deliberate, almost clinical in its attentiveness. She circled, stroked, pressed, each motion drawing me closer to something I had been afraid to feel. I moaned without shame, clutching her closer, my body moving against hers with increasing urgency. The orgasm came slowly, then all at once, a deep, trembling wave that left me breathless and shuddering in her arms. She held me through it, whispering nothing, just breathing with me, her skin against mine the only thing that kept me from floating away. After, we stayed tangled together, limbs draped and bodies humming. She rested her cheek against my chest, one hand stroking lazy circles on my stomach. I stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened, knowing only that nothing could ever be the same. The silence returned, but it was full now, weighted with shared breath, shared heat, shared release. I kissed her hair without thinking. She didn't move. She didn't speak, and I didn't need her to. There were no declarations, no demands, no aftermath full of questions, just the quiet weight of her head on my body and the slow thud of my heart as it tried to settle. My fingers traced the curve of her spine, memorizing it in the dim light of late afternoon. This wasn't about sex. It wasn't even about desire. It was about finding a place inside someone else where grief didn't have to be carried alone, where comfort went deeper than words ever could, where, for just 1 hour, neither of us felt like we were drowning. And that, I realized, was more intimate than anything I had ever known. The morning came slower than usual, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. I woke up wrapped in a heat that wasn't mine, her arms slung over my waist, her breath warm against my shoulder. The sunlight was barely peeking through the blinds, slicing the room into quiet lines of gold and shadow. I didn't want to move. My body still ached in the places she had touched, and my skin still held the echo of her mouth, her fingers, her breath. There was a stillness in the air, not awkward or empty, but full, like a room where something sacred had happened. She shifted beside me, still asleep, pulling herself closer with a soft exhale that brushed the back of my neck. I lay there, eyes wide open, trying to name what I felt. There was no fear, no regret, no panic clawing at my chest. Just a kind of fragile disbelief, as if I were suspended in a version of my life I hadn't planned for but didn't want to leave. Her presence felt so natural, so rooted, like she'd always belonged in that space beside me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stepped off the edge of something, and the ground beneath us hadn't caught up yet. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, wrapping a robe around myself with hands that trembled slightly. In the kitchen, everything looked the same, but it felt different. The mugs, the dish towel, the fridge magnets, they all seemed to be watching me, bearing witness to the change I couldn't put into words. I made coffee on autopilot, the sound of the brewing machine a steady rhythm against the silence in my head. When I turned around, she was standing in the doorway, still in the oversized shirt she'd slept in, hair wild, face unreadable. Our eyes met for a second too long before she walked past me, and something inside me nodded. We didn't talk about it that day. We didn't need to. Our bodies had already done the speaking. But there was a new tension between us, so soft it could have been mistaken for calm. Our movements were quieter, more measured. She sat on the couch with her knees drawn up, scrolling through her phone, but not really seeing anything. I watched her from the kitchen, trying to read her body language, trying to guess what story she was telling herself. She didn't look confused or angry. She looked distant, not absent, just elsewhere. I tried to keep the routine going, laundry, dishes, tidying up, but everything I touched felt slightly off, like I was rearranging the pieces of a puzzle without knowing what the final picture was. I caught myself glancing toward her more than once, waiting for some signal that things were okay, that we weren't drifting into something we couldn't name. But she stayed quiet, her gaze rarely meeting mine. The silence, once comforting, had started to stretch too far, thinning into something fragile and sharp. Later that night, we ended up back in the same bed. Not by plan, not by invitation, but by momentum. We brushed teeth side by side, shoulders bumping slightly, her yawn covering the lack of conversation. She climbed under the covers without hesitation, her body turning away from mine, curled inward like a question left unanswered. I lay down behind her, not quite touching, not quite apart, staring at the back of her neck until my eyes blurred. There were inches between us, but they felt like miles. I wanted to reach for her. I wanted to press my hand to the small of her back, to anchor her, to ask without asking if we were still somewhere together. But I didn't move. I was afraid that even the gentlest touch might shatter whatever fragile balance we were clinging to. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of her breathing, trying to match it with mine, like sinking heartbeats could fix what we wouldn't talk about. She didn't turn around, and I didn't sleep. The next morning, everything resumed its pace. She made toast, I folded blankets. We exchanged glances, maybe even smiles, but they didn't reach as far as they used to. Something had shifted, not backward, not forward, but inward. We were still close, still orbiting the same space, but the gravity had changed. I could feel the tension just beneath the surface, like a current beneath still water. We were pretending not to notice it, but it was there, undeniable and humming. That day, when she left for a walk, I stayed behind and wandered the apartment like a stranger. I looked at her books, her shoes, the pair of earrings she always left on the bathroom counter. Every object felt more intimate now, more dangerous. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to replay the night before, but my memory had softened the edges. What remained was the weight of her body against mine, the sound she made when she came, the warmth of her lips against my collarbone. It was still inside me, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if she saw it as a one-time lapse or the start of something else. I didn't know if she was already folding the experience into her grief, like a blanket over something she didn't want to look at. I was afraid to ask, afraid to push her away with a question that couldn't be unasked. And so I said nothing. I waited quietly, trying to hold still in a space that no longer felt entirely mine. She came back, dropped her keys in the bowl, and gave me a look that was almost familiar. We had dinner, we watched TV, we existed. But I could feel the weight of it in every moment. The way she brushed past me without touching, the way I hesitated before sitting too close, the way our eyes met for a second longer than necessary and then broke away. There was no going back to what we were before. The boundary had been crossed, the line had blurred, and though we had said nothing, everything between us was now colored by that afternoon. We weren't avoiding it, we were living in the echo of it, after, not before. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that arrives unnoticed with no real beginning. She had gone out for groceries, leaving behind the faint echo of her perfume and the open window humming with soft wind. I was doing laundry, folding towels in silence, letting the repetition keep me grounded. When I went to our room, because it had quietly become ours, I meant only to drop off a clean stack of shirts on the bed. But I saw something that didn't belong in the rhythm of the day. A notebook, spiral-bound, floral cover, peeking out from under her pillow like a forgotten secret. I should have looked away. I should have respected the silence between us, the delicate structure we had built out of shared glances and unspoken understandings. But I stood there, staring at the edge of that notebook as if it were calling me. My hands moved before my conscience could stop them. I pulled it free and held it for a moment, weighing the decision in my palms like it was something I could still return to the shelf of morality. And then I opened it. Her handwriting was careful, rounded, and slanted slightly to the right. There were dates scrawled in the top corners of each page, notes about daily errands, a few fragments of poetry I didn't recognize. But then came the entry, written in darker ink, pressed into the paper with more pressure than the rest. My name wasn't there, but I knew she was writing about me, about us, about that day, and about what it had meant to her, or rather, what it hadn't. She described our connection as a wound she didn't know how to clean. She wrote that I needed someone to hold, and she had been close enough to reach. She didn't call what happened love. She called it survival. She said she had given me her body because she knew I wouldn't ask for anything more. She said she didn't blame me. She blamed herself for wanting to be wanted, even if only as a substitute for someone I had lost long ago. She ended the page with a line that stayed etched into my skull long after I closed the notebook. I'm not the person she's touching. I'm the space where someone else used to be. I couldn't breathe. The words moved through me like shattered glass, invisible and cutting. My fingers went numb. The room began to tilt in a way that made no logical sense, like the ceiling had shifted just slightly out of place. I closed the notebook carefully, as if pretending I hadn't read it could undo the damage. I placed it back under the pillow exactly how I'd found it, aligning the edges with trembling precision. Then I left the room, the warmth drained from my skin. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the kettle, watching steam swirl in the air. I made tea the way I always did. Same mug, same honey, same tea bag steeped until the color was just right. But when I took the first sip, it felt wrong. Too hot, too sweet, like something had broken in the ritual. I imagined glass at the bottom of the cup, invisible but deadly. That's what it felt like, drinking something warm and familiar, only to discover it was laced with something sharp. She came back not long after, laughing softly as she kicked off her shoes, complaining to no one in particular about the lines at the store. I watched her from the hallway, my body frozen in place. She placed the groceries on the counter, humming a song under her breath. She looked at me and smiled, a soft, worn-out smile that used to make my chest swell. Now it made something cave in. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My tongue felt too thick, my throat too tight. I nodded, forced a smile, and helped her put things away. My hands moved without thinking, placing items in drawers and cabinets like muscle memory. But everything inside me was collapsing, folding inward, reshaping itself around the knowledge I wasn't supposed to have. I had thought we were building something, not perfect, not clear, but real. And now I knew I was standing in a space she had already emptied of meaning. That night, I lay awake long after she had fallen asleep. I could hear her breathing, steady and unaware, her body curled beside mine in the bed that had grown too cold. I kept thinking about that line, "I'm the space where someone else used to be." It looped in my head like a cruel lullaby. I tried to tell myself it wasn't true, that what I felt had been genuine, that the warmth, the hunger, the stillness in her arms had meant something. But doubt is a dangerous thing. It doesn't need proof, just a crack. I watched the shadows shift on the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep pretending, wondering if she knew I had read her private thoughts, wondering if she would ever say those things aloud. And most of all, wondering what it meant that I had taken comfort from something that had never been mine to keep. Her presence beside me felt like a lie I was helping to tell, and I didn't know how much longer I could bear it. The next morning, I didn't wait for her to wake up. I dressed quietly, moved through the apartment like a ghost, avoiding reflections. I went outside and sat on the porch with my tea, letting the cup cool in my hands. I didn't drink it. I couldn't, not with the taste of betrayal still lingering on my tongue, not with the sharpness still lodged somewhere deep inside me. Impossible to swallow, impossible to spit out. She left the way shadows disappear at sunrise, gradually, without sound, without drama. I didn't hear a suitcase rolling or door slamming. There was no goodbye note, just the absence of her coffee mug in the sink, the sudden vacancy of her scent in the hallway, the void in the bed that once held a shape beside mine. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom that morning and felt nothing at first. Then, everything. A wave of stillness so dense it drowned out the sound of birds outside and the creak of old floorboards beneath my feet. The apartment felt too clean, too symmetrical. Her towel was gone from the bathroom hook. The pair of earrings she always forgot on the dresser had disappeared. Even the throw blanket she used on the couch was missing, as if she had taken not just her belongings, but her entire existence from the space. I opened the closet and stared at the widened gaps between hangers, the silent confession that she had never intended to stay. The room wasn't empty. It was scraped clean, as if loving me had been a phase she outgrew before I even knew we had begun. I didn't cry. I didn't move for a long time. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the pattern on the wall, letting silence crawl into my ears until it became unbearable. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream, to curse her for not telling me what she planned, for not giving me the dignity of a conversation. But I couldn't, because deep down, I already knew. I had felt her slipping away in the weight of her silences, in the way her fingers stopped lingering on mine, in the way she looked past me instead of at me. Her body had stayed, but she had left days ago. Later, I found the mug she used most often tucked inside the cupboard behind some rarely touched plates. It was her way of saying she had been here, that she hadn't just vanished. I picked it up and held it close, pressing it to my chest like a relic. It still smelled faintly of her. I thought about throwing it away. I thought about smashing it against the tile just to hear something break. But instead, I put it back exactly where I found it, because I wasn't ready to erase her. Not yet. The days stretched out in a blur of repetition. I returned to old routines, made coffee for one, folded blankets no one used. Her absence settled into the apartment like new furniture, strange, imposing, something I had to learn to move around. I stopped going to the support group. I couldn't bear the thought of someone asking about her, or worse, pretending not to. The room where we met, where we shared quiet grief and accidental touches, now felt like a wound. I needed distance. From them, from her, from whatever version of myself had let this happen. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered through her old side of the closet, just to feel the air she used to move through. There, I found a single photograph she had left behind, probably by accident. It was an old print, slightly faded at the edges. We were sitting at the kitchen table, both mid-laugh, faces blurred from motion, as if joy had made us too alive to capture clearly. I don't remember when it was taken, but I remembered exactly how it felt. I ran my thumb over her outline, tracing a version of her that didn't exist anymore. Eventually, I began to speak to her in my head, in the quiet hours, in the grocery store, in the shower. I'd catch myself explaining things, what I was cooking, what the sky looked like, how the silence had changed its shape again. She became a presence in my absence, a shadow stitched to memory. Not a ghost, not quite, just someone I kept reaching for in a room where she no longer stood. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel haunted. I felt unfinished. One evening, weeks after she had gone, a new woman joined the support group. She was quiet, nervous, younger than me. She kept her hands in her lap and her eyes low. I watched her through the entire session, saw the way she folded inward, like someone waiting for permission to exist. After the meeting, she stood outside alone, clutching her coat like armor. I walked past her at first, but something stopped me. Something fragile. Something familiar. I turned around and offered her a ride. She hesitated, then nodded. In the car, she stared out the window, lips pressed tight, words swelling behind her silence. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. When we reached her street, she turned to me with that look I once knew, exhaustion mixed with hope, the kind of look that doesn't ask for help directly, but bleeds need in every breath. I didn't offer advice. I offered her my number. I told her if she ever couldn't sleep, she could call, and then I left. That night, lying in bed alone, I felt something shift. Not closure, not healing, but a quiet understanding that sometimes we aren't the destination. Sometimes we're just the warm light left on someone's darkness, the soft place to land before they learn how to walk again. What she and I had was real, even if it wasn't built to last. It existed in the space where names don't matter, where grief and comfort blur into something wordless. And I was beginning to see that this too was love, even if it didn't stay, even if it left me unfinished.